Hello, my name's Declan Carey. I'm a reporter at Redaction Politics, and today I'm joined by Marcus Johns from IPPR North. How are you doing today, Marcus?
Hi, Declan. I'm very good, thank you. How are you?
Very good, thank you. Today we're going to look a little bit about the North-South divide. Marcus, maybe just to start with, a lot of our viewers and readers come from different parts of the world. Can you just explain a little bit about, in the UK, what the North-South divide actually is and what it means?
Sure. So I think the North-South divide is a kind of historic way of looking at regional inequality in the UK, and particularly based on the kind of pattern of growth and development that we've seen in the past, say, 50 years or so. And it cuts across a whole range of things from economic growth, from productivity to employment outcomes, health outcomes, and things like that. I mean, perhaps quite, I suppose, controversially, or maybe not controversially, but not fitting with the general trend of things, we don't really see the North-South divide as the main regional inequality that exists in the UK. We see it more as kind of standard regional inequalities that have emerged in the past 20 or 30 years. So whilst there is looking at the data, if you were to just build a picture of the North and the South, and you would see that there are differences. I think what that tends to do is lock a kind of stereotypical path in people's heads of a kind of poor, behind, lagging North and a rich, thriving South. And that's not really the accurate picture. There are parts of the North that are very economically productive, that are very wealthy. There are parts of the South with really severe levels of poverty and really poor employment outcomes. So we tend to see, looking at the UK, a richer picture of regional inequality. Places like Cornwall, for example, have some of the worst employment outcomes and the weakest income levels in the country. Places like Cheshire do very well. So whilst the North-South divide captures the popular imagination, I think for us it's maybe not the best way to look at regional inequality in this country.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot more complicated than that, isn't it? And I think one thing that's true is it is too simplistic to only focus on, the North is the kind of poorer, sort of left behind relative, so to speak, as you say. I mean, I think your research, your role at IPPR North, it's very much looking at the economic side of it. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I deal with our transport and regional economics briefs, wings of what we do. And we've seen in recent years that change quite a lot, because the agendas like the Northern Powerhouse obviously have kind of become quite popular. They're well known, and that's been a really big change in policy making. Organisations like Transport for the North coming up, coordinating northern leaders in terms of what transport investment is being asked of government. So it's a really interesting field to work in, and it's changed so drastically in the past 5 years or so.
Yeah, definitely, I can imagine. I mean, let's sort of look at one of the big issues that perhaps separates parts of the UK from other countries, and that's the issue of centralisation. The idea that London is a hub which kind of soaks up or sucks in the power and the resources. That's definitely an image that exists in the UK. Do you think there's some sort of truth behind that, and does that cause consequences in different regions across the UK?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the UK is one of the most centralised countries in the developed world, in the OECD, and particularly in Europe. And it's at all levels. So if you look at kind of England, there isn't within England regional governance. There's not national governance. You have the devolved nations in the UK, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and then England, which doesn't have either its own England level governance or regional governance within it. And your average English council or local authority has a lot less powers, levers of control than counterparts in continental Europe might, over a whole host of things, from transport to being able to invest in economic development. And so what we have seen in the UK is, from the 1980s particularly, a lack of industrial strategy looking at economic growth in the country, but actually the lack of an industrial strategy is almost an industrial strategy in itself, because the way that it allowed the City of London particularly to take off the financialisation of the economy there has had really large consequences across the rest of the country as London took off really and separated out. And I think it's very clear when you look at the data how London, the southeast and bits of east of England have really separated over that time period. And a lot of that comes from the fact that outside of London, there haven't been people with enough powers and resources to affect change, come up with strategic plans for how you can make an economy work in a deindustrialised era. So certainly the centralisation of policymaking in London and the lack of power and resources outside of London has had a discernible effect on the economic histories of many places. And in recent years, that has come to be more recognised. The Northern Powerhouse, the Midlands Engine agendas are a start to recognising that these regional inequalities exist, and also that there are devolved policy levers that are answers to some of those problems.
Okay. I mean, you've mentioned a lot about how, you know, the way London has taken off is different from other parts of the UK. I definitely agree with you on that one. On that note, how divided is the UK? I mean, when I think about the IPPR North, the State of the North report that came out in 2019, I'm just going to sort of quickly bring it up here because there's quite an interesting, you know, highlight there that, yeah, here it is. They said that the UK is more region divided than any comparable advanced economy. So, I mean, how deep does that go?
So it's very distinct, I think, across income levels, employment and unemployment, and across health outcomes. It's very discernible. And actually, when you compare geographical inequalities in the UK to other countries, you see that there's various countries that we fall behind, you know, from Romania to South Korea, for example. And the problem with that is that places, I suppose, have become stuck, right? You have these economic inequalities, you have health inequalities, you have educational inequalities, and it kind of creates a path for those places where there isn't the levers to pull in success, there isn't the levers to give people more skills, there isn't the levers to grow business. And so really we see the need for devolution in answering how you can address those inequalities, because it is very deep across a whole suite of measures, and has been discernibly, I think, since I think it's about the 60s when things really started to shift, and then accelerating again in the 80s, across economic measures and social measures too.
Let's talk a little bit about devolution then. I mean, we now have mayors, don't we, across many northern cities, Manchester, Liverpool as well, and some really, to be honest, good evidence of work that's been there. I'm a native from Manchester in particular, and I know Andy Burnham has done really well tackling the crisis of, you know, people sleeping rough on the streets. So it does seem that when you give, you know, areas in the north, cities in the north, more power to control things and to make those decisions, the results are quite good. Is that the way forward, do you think?
Yeah, so I think something like 70% of people living in the north of England, which we define as the northwest, the northeast, and Yorkshire and Humber, are covered by a combined authority, which is one of the kind of devolved structures. And I think around half are covered by mayors now. And once West Yorkshire sorts its devolution deal out and will have a mayor, I imagine, within the next year or so, that takes us to a point, I think, where over half of the north are covered by a metro mayor. And they have a suite of powers. They have devolved adult education budgets. They have influence in terms of convening people. They can set out spatial frameworks for land use planning that obviously has a big impact on economic development in their place. But I think one of the things that's really important with most policy, but particularly economic policy, is that the decisions are taken at the level that they kind of most play out, right? So Andy Burnham's interventions on rough sleeping are, one, highlighting what was a localized issue in Greater Manchester and a particular kind of political priority that he was able to address, but also having the geography and the tools at his disposal to help address that is really important. And it's a much better model than having a minister in London announcing and having civil servants carry that out at a distance without knowing what the lay of the land looks like locally and without being able to bring partners together at an appropriate geographic scale to address issues. So as you said, we've seen that really clearly in Greater Manchester with rough sleeping, but it applies for a whole host of things too. Research and development investment, something like 60% of R&D spending in the UK ends up in the Golden Triangle, with London, Oxford, Cambridge. And how do you move beyond that? Well, bringing together partners, bringing together investors, bringing together businesses in local places, bringing together local authorities and economic development departments to work out how you can corral investment, how you can coordinate investment, create the right environment for research and development. Investment. Sorry, that's my cat.
I can see your cat.
And so, yeah, the proliferation of metro mayors has been quite useful in that. Although we think at IPPR North that there is a role for a larger coordination, pan-northern coordination on a host of different things that make sense at a larger scale. So intercity transport, for example, is a kind of policy area that makes sense to do regionally rather than city regionally. So things like Northern Powerhouse Rail, you need coordination across the Pennines and in different parts of the north to deliver those things. And similarly, international trade, to some extent foreign direct investment, and supporting supply chains are kinds of things that work most effectively at a regional level. So the metro mayors are fantastic for a lot of things, but there is still a need for coordination at the regional level. And we would say that whilst that has progressed, you've got Transport for the North, you've got the Northern Powerhouse 11 partnership of the local enterprise partnerships, and that is great. It's really good to have those institutions talking about this and developing policy. There's still a lack of policy levers and resources to deliver at the pan-northern scale.
Yeah, I mean, your cat's having a great time.
Yeah, I should have shut the door, sorry.
That's fine. What's your cat's name?
Toby.
Toby. She's made a great appearance. I'm sure that's going to be very popular. Yeah, just something I want to pick up on. I mean, that it sounds to me that it's kind of the way forward, that we do need to, have local people addressing local issues. Why do you think it took so long to come to this? I mean, I know, for example, that in the past, areas like Greater Manchester, I believe there was a vote where they rejected having a mayor quite some time ago. Then it was eventually implemented. But why do you think people from, cities like London have been making decisions that affect cities in the north of the UK and other parts of the UK for so long without really, trying to change that?
So, I mean, it's an interesting question that the UK was a very centralised country for a lot of its history. We sort of have forgotten, I think, how recent devolution to the UK's nations has been. You're talking about the beginning of the 21st century, the end of the 20th century for devolution to Wales and Scotland. There were around those times discussions around what regional devolution would look like. So the Northern Way was the first kind of collaboration across the north, and that started I think it was around 2004. And like you said, it was in the northeast. There was the regional assembly referendum, which is where Dominic Cummings cut his political teeth. I think when we look back on that, it looks like it was almost set up to fail. The powers were quite limited, and I think to some extent, when we look at evidence of what works, the Northeast as a region is maybe too small for some of the really effective powers of corralling international inward investment, for example. So it's been a very long time coming. It really took off in 2015 with the Northern Powerhouse agenda being launched by George Osborne in Manchester. But I think one of the things that's forgotten is how much there was upward pressure from particularly local authority leaders in Greater Manchester around that time. And that whilst, it does look like it was George Osborne's project, it was much more collaborative than I think is remembered. And it's kept that. And I think one of the things that's interesting about the Northern Powerhouse is how much it has grown into something that is owned by stakeholders in the north and policymakers in the north. And some of that is because there was new institutions like the mayors, and some of it is that there was a real desire for collaboration, working together, and recognising that if you were going to counterbalance the dominance of London across a host of policy issues, you needed to increase that voice and increase that collaboration. And I suppose it's just worth saying that we don't think that the model works for London either. And I think it's easy to get into thinking that it's sort of a London versus everywhere else, because a lot of the data looks like that. But again, when you drill down into what the centralisation, what centralisation in England looks like, you've seen that the model of investment in London has drastically increased land value, has drastically increased the cost of living, and that actually to some extent wages in London haven't increased to what you would expect if you just looked at what economic growth has been like. And so the benefits really of investing in London haven't flowed to Londoners. You know, some of the poorest boroughs in the country are in London. So the model doesn't work for anybody. And I think similarly to the north-south divide, there's been a change in debate towards this idea of London versus the rest. You know, London's a black hole and all of this sort of stuff. And I think in terms of the economic policy making, I can very much see where that lies, but it overlooks again that the model just doesn't work for anybody.
Yeah, okay. Looking sort of internationally, are there any other countries which you think are doing it quite well at the moment? One might think about, for example, in Belgium, where the regional parliaments there do wield quite significant amounts of power and can block bills, for example, without full agreement. Is that something that, you know, we can learn from?
I think there's lots of international examples we can learn from. I think Belgium's probably an interesting one. There's a whole host of kind of historic and cultural reasons for why it's set up in the way that it is. And I think thinking about the State of the North report, there's some elements in Belgium that actually that there's some quite stark regional divides exist in Belgium too. Other places that are maybe more kind of lessons that we can learn from. Germany, North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany is a region that's was quite like the north of England. It went through deindustrialisation in the second half of the 20th century, and then they used devolution and the sort of the polycentric model of cities that you get there to change their economic model and to reinvent themselves after deindustrialisation. And it's actually become I think a region that the North particularly could aspire to. Another example similar to that is the Randstad in the Netherlands. And again, they're regions that are collections of medium-sized cities, so that kind of compare to, you know, the string of cities that you get in the central belt of the North, Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, Sheffield, compared to places like Düsseldorf, Essen, and the other cities that make up North Rhine-Westphalia. And so they're models we can learn from. But there are interesting questions about the histories of places. So you look at the Spanish model, for example. The Spanish model is devolution rather than federalism. It's still the central government that decides what powers that the autonomous communities in Spain have. And there are issues and political parties in Spain that want to increase or decrease the level of powers that they have. But we can learn from, I think, Spain and to some extent Italy in the models that they've gone for, which aren't federalism, in a different way, because we don't have a federal UK or a federal England. And they're discussions that we need to have. You know, is it devolution or federalism? They are answers they're questions that need answers. Germany is a federal model as opposed to Spain, which is devolution. And there are key things and key powers that are very successful in those places. And a lot of them relate to economic development. Although I'm saying that because that's like the main thing I focus on, and I'm sure that my colleagues who work on social policy can talk very well about health devolution and things like that. But very much in terms of your transport infrastructure, business environment, skills and collaboration between universities and businesses to help innovation, all of those sorts of things are just very successful at the regional level. And the sorts of different powers that regions have across Europe particularly is interesting. I mean, I think in Italy, some of the regions can almost do their own international relations stuff that you definitely don't see in Spain, for example. So there's a whole range of powers and different models that we can look at across the world and learn from. But I definitely think that North Rhine-Westphalia and the Randstad are very good models for the north of England because of the way that their economic geographies map onto the north to quite a good extent.
Okay. Yeah, one thing that you've mentioned is that, yeah, other regions in other countries can have the power to do, things like international relations and really significant powers. The north of England does have quite a significant population without really sort of any representation in, on a national scale, really influence on a national scale. We do have parliaments in Scotland, in Wales, in Northern Ireland. Is it a crazy suggestion to think of putting a parliament in the north, or is it something which actually could benefit?
I don't think it's a crazy question, and it could have benefits. I think one of the things that we've kind of argued is the need to outline what powers work and what powers are needed at what geographies, and then build the institutions around them, rather than starting with hypothetical discussions about, do we need regional assemblies, do we need an English parliament, whatever the specific thing that people want to build is. I think, yeah, we tend to think you start with what's not working, what levers can you pull to address those, and then build the institutions. And I think we very much said in our research, I think over the past few years, that sub-regional, sub-regions like Greater Manchester and Liverpool City region are the starting blocks, the building blocks for whatever collaboration you want at regional levels. And so one of the things that we've argued for, I think in recent research that my colleague Luke Rakes published, was around starting out with a kind of collaboration between those regions, a Council of the North that comes together, and then once that has decided what its responsibilities ought to be, then looking at the institutions and working out what should work. Because I think one of the things we want to avoid is Westminster deciding these are the structures that we're going to have and you're going to go off and make them work, because ultimately that's what's been failing us for a significant amount of time. If it's at the flick of a minister's pen that these things live or die, then they won't work. They have to be built from collaboration and local buy-in, and that doesn't come, in my opinion, and from what the research suggests, from deciding what your structure is going to be before you decide what it needs to achieve.
Yeah. Definitely, that makes a lot of sense. And of course, a big issue would be, where would you even put it? I mean, I think that would be a big debate as well.
And there's a host of cultural and sort of arguments like that, which people feel very strongly about, that can distract from the fact that ultimately, when you're talking about devolution and the ability to change the shape of local economies and build better places, you're talking about improving people's lives and the means by which you achieve that. And the cultural arguments really matter, but they can distract from some of the really clear evidence that's out there of the power that devolution can have. And that's why I think we say you start with what you're trying to address, the powers to address it, and build your institutions around that.
Definitely. Thank you very much, Marcus. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
And goodbye to your cat as well.
Goodbye, Toby. He's trying to eat something off the table.